The title of today's KCD Monthly Missive is No Fault, No Blame, the Big Neo-Mutt Lie. Hare Om Namaha. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. George Orwell, 1984. A specter is haunting the Hare Krishna movement. It is the specter of Neo-Mutt. It is a ghost that emerged from Gaudiya-Mutt and represents it. The two other major institutions in what appears to be the Krishna movement are afflicted by it. In the late 70s and early 80s, Neo-Mutt, in its incipient stage, consisted of second echelon Prabhupada initiates who crossed the river. They broke their connection to so-called ISKCON in order to align themselves with and become sannyasis and gurus courtesy of an old but influential Gaudiya-Mutt leader in Navadvip. It could be argued that their radical act was the result of aggression and oppression by the high-flying zonal acharyas against these competitor godbrothers who were all below them in the ISKCON turtle tank. We discussed this later in our presentation, and there is some truth to it. It is far from the sole explanation, however. That comprehensive explanation is the Neo-Mutt Ghost Protocol. As per Orwell's most famous novel, Gaudiya-Mutt was to Prabhupada's bona fide branch of disciplic succession as the Orwellian clocks were to those we have known and used for centuries. This is particularly the case in one essential philosophical area, and that will be described threadbare as this article and its audio presentation proceeds. There is standard Vaishnava siddhanta. His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada brought us only that version when he founded his branch of the Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya in America in the mid-60s. Different from and opposed to this siddhanta, there are versions which do not represent the true Krishna teachings. Many so-called gurus came from India in the 60s to exploit the hippie religion in America at that time. Those gurus were not part of any Vaishnava Sampradaya, and obviously they were bringing different teachings not corresponding with Prabhupada's personalist version of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Those other concocted teachings from charismatic wildcard gurus were instantly attractive to thousands of young hippies. When an Eastern teaching is different from the siddhanta on a particular topic, it is known as an upa-siddhanta. The prefix upa means against. As such, an unauthorized teaching is against the standard Vedic or Vaishnava version. Another way of saying the same thing is that such a radical teaching is not a component of the absolute truth. The wild card gurus from India brought to the West many such ideas. Nevertheless, although not delving into superfluous tangents, we are going to analyze one important topic. This topic can be called theories about origination, with only one of them actually not being a theory at all. Instead, it is the actual truth of the origination of the jiva previous to its entrance into the cycle of birth and death. The self-styled gurus. The self-styled gurus from India took advantage of the hippie religion when they arrived in America. It was there for the taking. Prabhupada also exploited the same opportunity, but he gave the real thing to those hippies, whereas the others did not. From its beginning, the hippies had rock message music as an integral component of their philosophy, their mood, ethic, and their lifestyle. As the hippie religion was reaching its crescendo, one of those rock bands, the Moody Blues, which was, to some extent, influenced by Eastern teachings, gave us the following lyric accompanied by a catchy tune. I was thinking about our fortune, and I decided that we're really not to blame, for the love that's deep inside us all is still the same. Sounds good, perhaps carrying a heavy message. However, it does not represent truth. Instead, it represents an siddhanta. The absolute truth is that every one of us is really to blame for our predicament in birth and death. This is a key fact in determining the truth or falsity of so many theories about the jiva's entrance into samsara. We fell from the eternal spiritual world of form by our own choice, although it is more appropriate and accurate to say that we fell by misuse of our own free will. Our free will, not the will of the Supreme Lord. This is the message that Prabhupada brought to the West. This topic was either avoided by the so-called gurus or their impersonal conclusion rendered it blurred. Somewhat indirectly, the aforementioned lyric by the Moody Blues represents the siddhanta of no fall, no blame. Always remember that by his own affirmation, the hippies were Prabhupada's best customers. When they came to him, he reminded them that they were originally in the eternal world of spiritual planets with Krishna. As such, his magazine was called Back to Godhead, because real liberation means returning to where we all once were. In other words, we were all originally in that eternal world of form and activity. Although the Godhead includes the impersonal Brahmajyoti, the effulgence of the Supreme Lord, the subordinate living entities, known cumulatively as jiva tattva, did not initially originate from that part of the Godhead. Before that even, we were active in a form on spiritual planets. This was indubitably confirmed in an essay called The Tal and Crow Addendum, an excerpt from which is about to be read by me. Quote, so this dreaming condition is called non-liberated life, and this is just like a dream. Although in material calculation it is a long, long period. As soon as we come to Krishna consciousness, this period is considered a second. So when those who get Brahma Sayojya Mukti do not find transcendental bliss, they fall down to make a compromise with material bliss, for example, by founding schools and hospitals. So even Lord Brahma is still material and wants to lord it over the material world. He may come down to become a germ, but then he may rise up to Krishna consciousness and go back to home, back to Godhead. This is the position. So when I say yes, there is eternal Leela with Krishna, that means on the evidence of Jaya and Vijaya. Unless one develops full devotional service to Krishna, he goes up only to Brahma Sayujya, but falls down. But after millions and millions of years of keeping oneself away from the Leela of the Lord, when one comes to Krishna consciousness, this period becomes insignificant, just like dreaming. Because he falls down from Brahma Sayujya, he thinks that this may be his origin, but he does not remember that before that even, he was with Krishna, unquote. This excerpt is from an essay by Prabhupada. He recorded it in a dictaphone, and his personal secretary then transcribed it. It was a reply to the question of jiva tattva origination. This answer centered around the fall of Jaya and Vijaya from Vaikuntha, a place above and beyond the impersonal Brahman. This explanation is accessible only as an essay. It was an addendum to a letter Prabhupada dictated in June of 1972 and sent to Madhadwisha Das, the GBC for Australia. Although some would opine that it is a controversial topic, your author does not agree with that. I don't agree. Before we venture further into it, let me first take on what can be called the easy way out. You cannot dodge this essential topic, or if you prefer, essential issue, by opining that there can be two contradictory yet both valid opinions about it. That is nonsensical. It is a nonsensical position. It is illogical, and ultimately it's nothing but a dodge. As most of you know, the original breakaway group, which we rightly and accurately refer to as Neo-Mutt, propped up Swami B.R. Sridhar of Gaudiya Mutt as their new leader and as a pure devotee representing their faction of the Hare Krishna movement. In effect, they de facto turned him into the successor to Prabhupada not long after his divine grace departed physical manifestation in the middle of November 1977. It is a long, detailed, and complicated history. It is against our interest to get into those details here, although they are ascertainable. There are accurate conclusions to be drawn from them if you put in the research. Our presentation, on the other hand, is focused entirely on an analysis of one key component of the Neo-Mutt ghost protocol. Yet common sense and spiritual integrity demands that we confront and explain a kind of dodge, avoiding it, in this first part of our presentation. It is an explanation we are making that is based on the principle of non-contradiction. Two diametrically opposed conclusions cannot both be right. It is very possible that they can both be wrong, but they cannot both be right. When Neo-Mutt was first formulated and formed as the Mahamandala in the very late 70s and early 80s, it's now known as the World Vaishnava Association. Its spiritual leader was the aforementioned Swami B.R. Sridhar of Navadvip. No one disputes this historical fact. The later emergence of what is now called the Pure Bhakti Yoga Society in the district of Mathura was founded and centered upon a different Gaudiya Mutt leader, Swami Narayan. However, at that time, it was non-existent, and its departed leader had minimal influence on Prabhupada's disciples during that time frame that we are describing here, far less He had far less influence than Swami B.R. Sridhar. At that time, some recent influential Gaudiya Mutt books were in print. They were different, very different, in mood, in their style and substance from Prabhupada's mood, style, and substance. They were intoxicating for those inclined to come under their sway. They were also different in one key conclusion, obviously. This refers to the root issue of the origination of jiva tattva. In those books, we find the following excerpts, quote, "Somehow or other, from the undifferentiated came the differentiated," unquote. And we find this one, quote, "The fallen souls come from the marginal position within the Brahmajyoti and not from Vaikuntha," unquote. And, quote, "Their equilibrium somehow became disturbed," unquote. All of this is mistaken knowledge. In essence, these quotes opined that the living entities came from the Brahmajyoti, the undifferentiated, and then fell from there originally, somehow or other, into the world of duality, the cycle of birth and death. This was, and remains, an all-pervading misconception held by everyone in Gaudiya Mutt. It is attributed by those devotees to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Goswami, the founder Acharya of the Gaudiya Mutt, almost a century ago. You should be very skeptical about that attribution. The aforementioned Swami Narayan held this misconception without question. For what it's worth, he directly stated this Gaudiya Mutt presupposition to me in late 1983 in Mathura at his temple, which I was visiting and living in at the time. His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada held the exact opposite conception, as has been clearly brought forth in the addendum. We have mentioned how some devotees dodge this issue. How they do so is that they opine that the fault of Swami B.R. Sridhar was not his teaching about origination. Many of them are agnostic about it. Instead, they opine that according to so-called Vaishnava etiquette, he had no right to represent a teaching that was in contradiction to what Prabhupada taught his disciples. In other words, there's no problem with propagating the no fault, no blame Siddhanta, but it should not have been taught to Prabhupada's disciples because he taught them differently. Disregarding how utterly awkward and unworkable that so-called etiquette would have been for the fledgling group under Swami Sridhar's guidance, such a sophisticated ploy is nothing more than a nonsensical dodge. This essential topic of origination cannot be avoided in that way. The stark and root issue of the origination of the jiva tattva is not something that can be overlooked and disregarded on the basis of so-called Vaishnava etiquette. The root issue of jiva origination has to be confronted and resolved, and that resolution is exactly what you are receiving in this presentation. Now, with this preliminary sidebar about the dodge clarified, let us proceed to grind away in order to get at the truth, and with it the untruth, intrinsically connected to this essential topic of origination. We have already given a very strong hint about it, about the siddhanta of this issue, via that excerpt from the Tal and Crow addendum, which I just spoke previously. Consider also the following excerpts. One is from a purport to Srimad Bhagavatam, and the other from a question and answer session after a platform lecture in 1967, which obviously was very early in Prabhupada's movement. quote, arguments may be put forward as to why we have been put under the influence of this material energy by the supreme will of the Lord. A living entity misuses his little independence when he wants to lord it over material nature. This misuse of independence, which is called Maya, is always available. Otherwise, there would be no independence. Independence implies that one can use it properly or improperly. It is not static. It is dynamic. Therefore, misuse of independence is the cause of being influenced by Maya. That's from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 31, Text 15, Prabhupada's purport. Notice the phrase, quote, why we have been, unquote. Why we have been when? This lifetime? Maybe, but it's more logical that the context indicates before that. Could that context be interpreted to mean originally? It most certainly could. Indeed, that is the application of the context that makes the most sense, all things considered. And here's that second Q&A excerpt. Disciple, when the souls that were never conditioned at all, do they also have the independence? Prabhupada, yes, but they have not misused. They know that I am meant for Krishna's service and they are happy in Krishna's service. Disciple, could they ever misuse it? Prabhupada, yes, they can misuse it also. That power is there. That's a Q&A from after a platform lecture on February 18th, 1967 in San Francisco. Now, the devotee asking this question was one of the first initiated disciples in America. As such, he may well have been asking this question for the first time of Prabhupada, seeking clarification, not only for himself, but for the rest of the fledgling ISKCON movement. Notice that devotee's question is phrased as, quote, the souls that were never conditioned at all, unquote. Who would those be? The obvious and unequivocal answer is the spirit souls in Vaikuntha. That such was the case will be validated a bit later in our presentation. Also in Prabhupada's answer, he clarifies which souls are being referred to by the clause, quote unquote, in Krishna's service. Indeed, this clause is stated twice in the sentence of his original letter, which answered the question. It is a fantastic stretch to say that the spiritual sparks floating in the Brahmajyoti are actually engaged in service. They can be said to be so in one very, very unimportant, indirect, and minute way, namely that each of them provides an extremely small spark of light comprising the effulgence of Godhead, and nothing more than that. If you want to stretch the rubber band and say that that's, quote unquote, in Krishna's service, well then it's certainly not Dasya Rasa. And it's not Shanta Rasa of the buffer region either. The living entity has independence in properly or improperly using or misusing free will. If its origin was in the Brahmajyoti, how and why can the initial misuse of independence actuate? That spark must initially be thrown into the material world by a force more powerful than it is. If the Supreme Person originally made the jiva nothing more than an impersonal spark in the Brahmajyoti, how is it that such a spark's, quote, equilibrium somehow becomes disturbed, unquote? How could such an initial fall down be the jiva's fault or responsibility? It was simply floating there, as originally created to do, allegedly. Can its descent be some kind of fault based upon free will? How utterly illogical such an assertion is. More importantly, how utterly arbitrary and unfair that would have been. As we have stated numerous times for decades, anyone advocating no fault, no blame must ultimately believe, at least subconsciously, that evil is supreme. This is one of the reasons why such an siddhanta is also covert mayavad. Tattvamasi. Is this origination issue, is it really all that controversial? If you want more evidence, here are two more excerpts. Consider this quote from a room conversation on September 19th, 1973. Quote, "So there is chance of falling down even from the personal association of God," unquote. Can I read it again? Quote, "So there is chance of falling down even from the personal association of God," unquote. Now here's another one from a letter to a leading secretary, dated April 25th, 1970. Quote, "The souls are endowed with minute independence as part of their nature, and this minute independence may be utilized rightly or wrongly at any time. So there is always a chance of falling down by misuse of one's independence." In the first excerpt, notice the phrase, quote, "personal association of God," unquote. Personal is in diametric opposition to impersonal. Floating as a spiritual spark in the Brahmajyoti is an impersonal condition. No sane transcendentalist disputes that. Falling down from there could not mean falling from the personal association of God. As a side note, it is a misconception that the Supreme Lord is not personally present in the buffer region of Vaikuntha, but it is a correct conception that he is not personally present in the impersonal Brahman because it's his effulgence. In the excerpt from the 1970 letter, notice the phrase, quote, "minute independence may be utilized rightly or wrongly at any time," unquote. Are you actually prepared to limit any time only to the material sojourn? Minute independence is part of the jiva tattva's eternal nature both here and there. The jivas in the spiritual world of form and activity are not without minute independence at any time. And in this excerpt, Prabhupada was responding to a letter sent to him by a leading secretary. Check your premise more carefully if you think that his answer was limited to the material sojourn. It could not be so limited, because that secretary's question was not about jiva fall down while in the material atmosphere of samsara. In point of fact, his question was just the opposite. It was about the initial fall down from the personal region of the Godhead. Prabhupada summarizes his disciple's question in the reply he gave to his disciple, and part of that summary, which we have not directly quoted, contains the following phrase, quote, "if someone has a relationship with Lord Krishna," unquote. Prabhupada's summary also established that the relationship referred to must be on a spiritual planet. You may wrongly believe that knowledge about the origination of Jiva Tattva, especially as detailed in the Tal and Crow addendum, which we read previously. You may believe that the Tal and Crow addendum was everywhere shared and made readily available to all the members of the movement during the 70s and early 80s. That would be a major misconception on your part, because it was not. In point of fact, that essay was kept secret and hardly anybody knew about it. That was the situation until just before the major schism with Swami B.R. Sridhar and so-called ISKCON. With that schism looming, all of a sudden the Tal and Crow addendum was propagated. It was promulgated in a BBT report, the report being called Nectar of the Month, in January 1982, entitled "The Origin of the Jiva, Brahmajyoti or Krishna Lila." if you think its emergence at that time, just short of a decade after the addendum was first created, was some kind of coincidence, guess again. So-called ISKCON was partly responsible in laying the groundwork for Neo-Mutt gaining traction. We shall discuss this subsequently as promised. Almost entirely, that was due to the vitiated GBC lapping up all of the bad advice from Swami B.R. Sridhar, especially in the spring of 1978. But by 1981, he was turning against the cult, and even before 1981. So-called ISKCON would split from him in the spring of 1982, and the writing was on the wall in the first month of that year. The high-flying zones were still receiving Uttama Udhikari worship at that time, up to and including much of 1986 as it turned out. Their basis for receiving it, for such narcissistic, unauthorized, and undeserved worship had been Swami B.R. Sridhar's statement that the disciple had to look upon his spiritual master as a Jagat Guru. In the early 80s, he was allowing second echelon ISKCON men to join him, and Neo-Mutt was gaining traction. As such, a way had to be found to combat him without totally abandoning what he had earlier proposed and what so-called ISKCON had thus implemented, quote, after consultation with higher authorities, unquote. The major upasiddhanta of no fall was an obvious weapon, and they pulled it out and they dusted it off from the vault. Again, as we already stated, that was the Talon Crow addendum. To reiterate, that addendum was not made public previously because the, air quotes, ISKCON leaders did not want to even slightly taint the legitimacy and prominence they had bestowed upon Swami B.R. Sridhar. He was very useful to them in the late 70s. Please also note that this man had no influence whatsoever in Prabhupada's branch of Chaitanya's movement previous to 1978. The rank and file of Prabhupada's movement had never even heard of him. Then, all of a sudden, he and his cliches, bromides, and tropes became the equivalent of sacred script. That was obviously because the 11 Ritviks were able to use his so-called great status, as well as his bad advice, to their advantage in setting themselves up to be worshipped as the sum total of all demigods. Just as importantly, he lent credence to the presupposition that the Ritviks were to become Diksha gurus after the disappearance of Prabhupada, when he said, quote, Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya, unquote. Neo-Mutt Ghost Protocol rationalizes Prabhupada's preaching to suit its own mood and style. In this presentation, we are not discussing mood and style as a topic point, however. Instead, we are emphasizing teaching, one particular teaching, obviously. Rationalization on the part of Neo-Mutt, being bona fide, certainly extends to this teaching in a very big way. They warp it. Neo-Mutt has its explanations, but chiefly utilizes two of them in order to rationalize Prabhupada's clear affirmation about the personal origination of the jiva tattva beyond impersonal Brahman. Consider this clear teaching by Prabhupada from a platform lecture delivered on October 7th, 1975. Quote, we have come from the spiritual world into this material world. We have forgotten our Father, so we have to revive this relationship with our Father, or God, or Krishna, unquote. Platform lecture, October 7th, 1975. Neo-Mutt rationalizes this. Of course they do. They can state that the spiritual world includes the impersonal Brahman, and of course that's true. They can then claim that in the impersonal Brahman, the living entity remembered God. What God? ostensibly created as a mere and insignificant spark, how was such personal remembrance possible? Neo-Mutt can say, however, once having fallen from the Brahmajyoti, the jiva forgot God. Forgot what? Forgot the effulgence? Neo-Mutt preaches that the material sojourn offers the jiva the opportunity to return to a higher platform than impersonal Brahman, to attain a personal relationship with the Supreme Lord in a spiritual planet. This explanation is close to the truth, but not close enough. Close only counts in horseshoes, darts, and hand grenades. Rationalizing about Prabhupada's preaching does not coincide with what his above-mentioned statement communicates. In that platform lecture, the Acharya says, quote, revive this relationship. As such, Neo-Mutt fails because reviving this relationship cannot mean logically reviving so-called relationship that a jiva has to God when it's in the Brahmajyoti. Now that's the sum and substance of Neo-Mutt's first rationalization. The second Neo-Mutt rationalization is anti-historical. It is also extremely insidious and does tremendous damage in that way. It rationalizes that Prabhupada preached personal origination to his Western disciples because they were all indoctrinated in Christian and Talmudic religious teachings along with similar social settings. Both of those teachings and settings emphasize God as a person in heaven. Heaven, by the way, a place which is not at all understood rightly by either of those two religions. And they emphasize some kind of personal relationship with him there. Heaven, however, is not eternal. But such is the foggy anti-Vedic dogma by its very nature. According to this second Neo-Mutt rationalization, Prabhupada had to change the real teaching. Allegedly, he had to advocate a return to an original personal relationship with God in Vaikuntha, not heaven, because Westerners would only accept that as they were taught something similar. It is a queer and ridiculous rationalization. It is also somewhat indirectly offensive to the Acharya. A genuine guru cannot change a Vaishnava teaching in the name of preaching. That is forbidden. The process can be modified to some extent by the Acharya, and certainly Prabhupada did that. However, the siddhanta cannot be modified. Any so-called disciple who believes that Prabhupada did this, which would have to have meant preaching an Upasiddhanta for circumstantial reasons in order to recruit Western followers, would ultimately not be able to place his or her faith in him. At least subconsciously, no one would be able to trust Prabhupada if it became known that he did that. And let me emphasize emphatically, he did not do that. However, there's another factor. Prabhupada's initial disciples may have been mostly raised as youngsters and young adolescents in Christian or Talmudic families. However, when they came to him, they had all abandoned that ritual belief system, that dogma, for many years. The vast majority of Prabhupada's first and second waves of disciples were hippies, and they were not a theistic bunch. Indeed, many of them were dedicated atheists, followers of Nietzsche. Their lifestyles were not conducive to being attracted to any kind of disciplined theistic formula centered around a supreme person. Those hippies who joined Prabhupada did not require him to preach to them that they were all originally with a Supreme Lord in a personal relationship higher than being spiritual sparks in the Brahmajyoti. The impersonal idea also contains a lack of responsibility. The teachings brought by the other gurus, were basically that you merge into the white light and become God. This is also atheism. If you were originally only in that light, how can you be responsible for having left it? As such, subordination of responsibility was not a theme intrinsic to all those other gurus. And there's an irony here also. There was and is in some of those impersonal cults a heavy duty and forceful emphasis on blind obedience to the guru, since he had or has allegedly become Brahma realized and therefore God. In fact, most hippies were strongly inclined towards impersonalism. If Prabhupada had changed the teaching to an emphasis on the impersonal Brahman, and again, he did not, but if he had done so, that almost certainly would have increased his recruiting. Indeed, because he stuck to the actual siddhanta, it is almost certain that fewer people in the West came to him from the hippie religion than otherwise would have. The origination siddhanta of eternal servitude did not harmonize with most hippies. It was not the kind of occult transcendence that most of them were looking for or expected from their gurus of choice. Indeed, the other so-called gurus would have been more attractive to them, and such undeniably turned out to be the case in America. The hippies were influenced by the message music of their rock bands, which always had defiant themes, a touch of Renaissance humanism, some early 19th century romanticism, along with impersonal teachings from the East and also impersonal Western antiquity. Previous to scholasticism, Western philosophy was impersonal, and that applied to Neoplatonism certainly. However, sometimes personalism entered even there, such as this excerpt from the Neoplatonic writings of Plotinus, quote, "Let us flee then to the beloved fatherland. Here is sound counsel. The fatherland for us is there whence we have come. There is the Father," unquote. If we were originally just floating in the Brahmajyoti, created in that way, as an infinitesimal small spark floating in the effulgence of ultimate source, why were we plunged into the material atmosphere of birth and death from that state? If that was our original state of being, if we never had or could have experienced anything other than the impersonal, and if we had never experienced any kind of happiness within the spiritual realm of form and activity, what would be the impetus to fall down from the basic ananda that was and is present in Brahman? How could we want personal relationship if we had never experienced any kind of it? What about the arbitrariness of such an alleged fall down? The impersonal origination Upasiddhanta does not account for that in any logical or fair way, does it? In other words, some kind of supreme controller, according to both Gaudiya-Mutt and Neo-Mutt, created each of us as an infinitesimal, ultra-small spark floating in a realm of impersonal ananda with other sparks, and then plucked us out of there. He then tossed us into the realm of pain, the realm of evil. But why? An impersonal spirit spark with no previous personal experience cannot possibly be responsible for that. Also, how is it possible not to be affected by, at least subconsciously, the idea and feeling that evil is supreme? No fall, no blame, yet why be plunged into a very bad place where evil predominates at virtually every level? And even where it doesn't, still there's death. On the subject of responsibility, who and or what was responsible for second echelon men in Prabhupada's movement ditching ISKCON in order to join Swami B.R. Sridhar and form Neo-Mutt? Who and or what is responsible for all of those upstarts abandoning one of Prabhupada's most important teachings, the origination of the jiva. After he departed physical manifestation, who and or what is responsible for that first big crack? Is the Navadvip Mahant responsible? Certainly, but far from fully. Are each and every one of those men who jumped the gun to become guru in another line and cross the river responsible? Without a doubt. But again, not fully. Is so-called ISKCON and the vitiated GBC responsible? Without a doubt. So-called ISKCON and the vitiated GBC are responsible for the no-fall, no-blame Siddhanta camel getting its nose under the movement's tent. That negative development had terrible repercussions then, and those terrible repercussions still reverberate today. If the GBC had remained faithful to Prabhupada's directives and desires, those repercussions would not have transpired. Certainly not to anywhere near the extent that they did. A handful of disgruntled second echelon men might have linked up with Gaudiya Mutt. Still, they would have been very few, and they would have never gained any significant traction. Can't put the toothpaste back in the tube now, however. The rank and file knew nothing of Swami B.R. Sridhar until the late 70s. He had no influence in the movement, and virtually no influence with the movement's leaders either. After Prabhupada left the scene, it was various, air quotes, ISKCON leaders, with no resistance, but instead with encouragement from the vitiated GBC, who pushed Swami B.R. Sridhar out from obscurity into the movement's limelight. It was so-called ISKCON which followed and allowed his bad advice on how to carry on, as well as his impersonal origination Siddhanta, to gain the initial prominence that it did. That set the stage for second echelon betrayal in a big way, as it has now metastasized into the Gaudi World Vaishnava Association and all the fanfare that represents and promotes. The colossal hoax known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It has transformed itself 3 times since early 1978. Post-1977, if you were loyal to it, that band you were in soon started playing different tunes. With today's Hindu hodgepodge and FDG, it is playing yet but another one. To wrongly believe you can find transcendental stability and substance by joining Neo-Mutt will entail the same experience, but in a different way. Both so-called ISKCON and Neo-Mutt are concoctions, and both have been heavily influenced by Gaudiya Mutt. Prabhupada called Gaudiya Mutt asara, or useless, his conclusion about it being so as specifically enshrined in his books. However, you can't tell what is what, or even what time it really is, if you're caught in the vortex of either of these 2 Sahajya entities. Very soon, each of their clocks, along with their latest tunes, will be striking a baker's dozen. Things will soon be so radically changed in them that everything will be beyond recognition, if it isn't even already. Sadeva Samya.